The rifle shot echoed across the dusty square of Stockton, California, and every man within earshot turned to see the tin can still spinning in the air from where it had been launched skyward by a second bullet before it could hit the ground. Stella Garrett stood with her Winchester held loose in one hand, her dark hair pulled back in a practical braid, her boots planted firm in the dirt as she looked at the mayor with eyes that said she had proven her point, and then some. It was late spring in 1882, and the town had been arguing for 3 weeks about who should represent Stockton at the territorial shooting competition in Sacramento. The men had lined up one after another, each convinced he would be the natural choice, but Stella had outshot every last one of them without breaking a sweat. Her father had taught her to shoot when she was barely tall enough to hold a rifle steady, and in the 15 years since, she had practiced until the weapon felt like an extension of her own body. "Well," Mayor Henderson said, tugging at his collar despite the mild temperature, "I suppose we have our answer." The crowd of men around them muttered and grumbled, but none could argue with what they had witnessed. Stella had hit targets they had missed, and she had done it faster and cleaner than any shooter the town had produced in a generation. Her father, rest his soul, would have been proud. He had died 2 winters past, leaving her the small ranch on the outskirts of town and a reputation as the daughter of the best marksman in the San Joaquin Valley. She nodded to the mayor, shouldered her rifle, and turned to walk back toward the general store where she had left her horse. That was when she first saw him, the stranger leaning against the hitching post with his hat pulled low and his arms crossed over his chest. He was watching her with an intensity that made her steps slow just a fraction before she caught herself and kept walking. "Excuse me, miss," he said, pushing off from the post and moving into her path. He was tall, with broad shoulders and dark blonde hair that curled slightly at his collar. His face was sun-weathered but young, probably no more than 25, and his gray eyes held something she could not quite name. That was some shooting. "Thank you," Stella said, moving to step around him. She was used to men wanting to talk to her after a demonstration, usually to explain why their own poor performance had been due to the sun in their eyes, or a defective weapon, or some other excuse that had nothing to do with skill. "Wait," he said, and there was something in his voice that made her pause. "I mean it. I have been shooting since I was old enough to hold a gun, and I have never seen anyone handle a rifle like that. You have got a gift." Stella studied him more carefully. He wore the clothes of a working cowboy, dusty denim and a worn leather vest, but his gun belt was well maintained and his boots were good quality. His hands, when he gestured, were calloused but steady. "You work around here?" she asked. "Just got into town yesterday," he said. "Name is Quentin Ellis. I have been working cattle drives up and down the valley, but I am looking to settle somewhere for a while. Stockton seems like a decent place." "It is," Stella agreed, still wary but finding herself less inclined to walk away. There was something genuine in his manner, none of the swagger or wounded pride she usually encountered. "Stella Garrett." "I know," he said, and when she raised an eyebrow he added quickly, "I asked around after I saw you practicing this morning. They said you run your father's ranch by yourself. That you are the best shot in 3 counties. They exaggerate," she said, but she felt a small flush of pride anyway. Quentin shook his head. "I do not think so. Listen, Miss Garrett, I know this is going to sound strange, but I was wondering if you might consider teaching me what you know. About shooting, I mean. I can pay for lessons. I am good, but I want to be better, and after seeing what you can do, I figure you are the person to learn from." Stella felt her defenses rise automatically. Why would a cowboy need shooting lessons? You planning on entering competitions? "No," he said, meeting her eyes directly. I am planning on staying alive. The last drive I was on, we got hit by rustlers. 3 good men died because they could not shoot fast enough or straight enough when it mattered. I got lucky, but luck runs out. I want skill. I want to be able to protect myself and anyone who might be depending on me." The honesty in his voice struck something in her. She thought of her father, who had always said that shooting was not about ego or glory, but about taking responsibility for your own survival. She thought of the long evenings when he had worked with her, patient and thorough, until she could hit a target in the near dark by feel as much as by sight. "I do not usually teach," she said slowly. "I know, but I am asking anyway, please." She should have said no. She had the ranch to run, and the competition in Sacramento was only 2 weeks away. She needed to practice, not waste time with a stranger who might or might not have the dedication to actually learn. But something in Quentin Ellis's gray eyes made her hesitate, made her think that maybe this was not a waste of time at all. "All right," she said finally, "but I do not have patience for people who do not take it seriously. If I am going to teach you, you show up when you are supposed to, you listen to what I tell you, and you practice until you get it right. Understood?" "Yes, madam," he said, and the smile that spread across his face was like the sun breaking through clouds. "When do we start?" "Tomorrow morning." "Dawn. Meet me at my ranch about 3 miles west of town. There is a sign at the gate, Garrett Ranch. Do not be late." "I will be there," he promised. Stella nodded and walked past him to where her horse, a sturdy bay mare named Rosie, waited patiently. She could feel Quentin's eyes on her as she mounted and turned the horse toward home, but when she glanced back, he had already started walking in the direction of the boarding house, his stride long and purposeful. That night, as she sat on her porch watching the stars come out over the valley, Stella wondered what she had gotten herself into. She had built her life around solitude and self-sufficiency since her father's death. Her mother had passed when Stella was just a child, and she had no siblings, no close family left in California at all. The ranch hands who helped during busy seasons were professionals who did their work and went home to their own families. She had friends in town, other women who invited her to socials and church gatherings, but she always felt slightly apart from them, marked by her unusual skills and her independence. Teaching Quentin Ellis to shoot meant letting someone into her world, into the routines and spaces that had been hers alone. It meant conversation and proximity, and all the small vulnerabilities that came with sharing knowledge. She told herself it was just business, that his money would help with the ranch expenses and his presence would be temporary. But something in her chest felt tight and uncertain, like she was standing at the edge of something she could not quite see. She went to bed thinking of gray eyes and honest questions, and when she woke before dawn the next morning, she found herself taking extra care with her appearance before she caught herself and laughed at her own foolishness. He was a student, nothing more. She braided her hair, dressed in her work clothes, and went out to set up targets in the field behind the barn where the light was good and the backdrop was safe. Quentin arrived exactly at dawn, riding a tall chestnut gelding that looked like it had been bred for cattle work. He dismounted and tied the horse next to Rosie, then walked over to where Stella waited with an eager expression that reminded her of her younger self, hungry to learn everything her father could teach. "Good morning," he said. "Morning," she replied. "You brought your rifle." He patted the Winchester in his saddle scabbard. "Never go anywhere without it." "Good. Go get it and come over here." She spent the first hour just watching him shoot, studying his stance and his grip and the way he sighted down the barrel. He was competent, she had to give him that. He hit the targets more often than not, and his reloading was smooth. But there were inefficiencies in his movement, small hesitations that added up to lost time, and his breathing was not quite synchronized with his trigger pull. "You are tensing your shoulders," she said after he had emptied his rifle for the third time. "See how they creep up toward your ears when you aim? That throws off your stability. You need to stay relaxed. Let the rifle do the work." Quentin lowered the Winchester and rolled his shoulders experimentally. "I never noticed that. Most people do not. It is an instinct bracing for the recoil. But if you are braced, you are rigid, and rigid means slow. Here, watch me." She picked up her own rifle and demonstrated, settling into her stance with the ease of long practice. Her shoulders stayed down and loose, her breathing slow and even. She fired 5 shots in rapid succession, each one hitting the center of a different target, and then lowered the rifle and turned back to him. "See the difference?" "Yes," he said, and there was something almost like awe in his voice. "Can you show me again? Slower this time." She did, walking him through each element of her stance and her breathing, explaining the mechanics of how she kept her body loose while maintaining control. Quentin listened with complete focus, asking questions that showed he was not just hearing her words but thinking about them, integrating them into his understanding. When he tried again, she could see the difference immediately. His shots were not perfect, but they were better, more consistent. He was a quick learner, she had to give him that. And he did not get frustrated or defensive when she corrected him, just nodded and tried again. They worked until the sun was high and the heat was starting to build. Stella called a break and led him over to the pump by the barn where they could drink cold water and sit in the shade. Quentin took off his hat and ran a hand through his sweat-dampened hair, and Stella found herself noticing the line of his jaw and the way his shirt clung to his shoulders. She looked away quickly, taking a long drink from her cup. "This is harder than I thought it would be," Quentin said, but he was smiling. "I thought I was a decent shot, but you are making me realize how much I have been doing wrong." "You are not doing things wrong exactly," Stella said. "You just never had someone teach you the details. Most men learn to shoot from other men who learned from other men, and bad habits get passed down without anyone realizing. My father was obsessive about technique. He studied shooting the way some people study music or mathematics. He was always reading books, talking to other marksmen, experimenting with different methods, and then he taught me everything he learned." "He must have been an extraordinary man," Quentin said quietly. "He was," Stella agreed, feeling the familiar ache of loss. "He believed that if you are going to do something, you should do it right. Not for show, but because excellence matters. Because the world is unpredictable and dangerous, and the skills you have might be the difference between living and dying." Quentin nodded slowly. "That is why I am here. That is why I asked you to teach me. I watched a friend die because he hesitated at the wrong moment. He was reaching for his gun and the rustler was faster. Just a fraction of a second, but that was all it took. I do not want to hesitate. I do not want to be the reason someone else gets hurt because I was not good enough." The intensity in his voice made Stella look at him more closely. "You feel responsible for what happened." "I do," he said simply. "Maybe that is not fair to myself. Maybe there was nothing I could have done differently. But I keep thinking that if I had been better, faster, more aware, maybe I could have helped him. Maybe it would have turned out different." Stella understood that kind of thinking. She had spent months after her father's death wondering if she could have noticed his illness sooner, gotten him to a doctor faster, done something, anything, to change the outcome. "Sometimes bad things just happen," she said, "and no amount of skill or speed can prevent them. But I understand wanting to be prepared, wanting to be the kind of person who does not freeze when it matters." "Exactly," Quentin said, meeting her eyes. "That is exactly it." They sat in comfortable silence for a few moments, and Stella felt something shift between them, a recognition of shared understanding. Then she stood and dusted off her pants. "Come on, let us work on your quick draw. That is where speed really matters." They spent the rest of the morning on draw drills, and Stella found herself enjoying the teaching more than she had expected. Quentin was attentive and hardworking, and he had a way of asking questions that made her think about her own techniques more deeply. Why did she position her holster exactly that way? What was the advantage of her particular grip? She had to articulate things she had always done by instinct, and in doing so, she understood her own skills more fully. When Quentin finally left in the early afternoon, promising to return the next morning, Stella felt energized rather than tired. She went about her afternoon chores with a lightness in her step, and when she caught herself humming while she mucked out the stalls, she shook her head at herself but did not stop. The days fell into a rhythm after that. Quentin arrived at dawn and they worked together until noon, sometimes longer if he was struggling with a particular technique. He proved to be as dedicated as she had hoped, practicing on his own in the evenings and coming back each morning with new questions and observations. His shooting improved rapidly, and Stella felt a teacher's pride in watching him develop. But it was more than just the shooting lessons. They talked while they worked, sharing stories about their lives and their pasts. Stella learned that Quentin had grown up on a small farm in Missouri, that he had left home at 18 after his parents died in a fever outbreak, that he had been drifting ever since, working whatever jobs he could find but never quite settling anywhere. "I kept thinking I would find a place that felt like home," he said one morning while they were setting up targets. "But everywhere I went, I felt like I was just passing through, until I got to Stockton. I do not know why, but something about this place feels different. Feels like maybe I could actually stay." Stella felt her heart beat a little faster. "What would you do if you stayed? Keep working cattle drives?" "Maybe," Quentin said. "Or maybe find a piece of land, start my own small operation. I have some money saved up. Not much, but enough to buy a modest spread if I find the right place. Build something permanent, something that is mine." "I know," Stella said, thinking of her own ranch, the satisfaction of working land that belonged to her. There is something good about having roots. About knowing you are building toward a future instead of just surviving day to day. "That is it exactly," Quentin said, and his smile made her stomach flutter in a way that had nothing to do with hunger. She was falling for him, she realized, with a mixture of excitement and fear. Somewhere between the shooting lessons and the quiet conversations, between watching his determination and seeing the kindness in his eyes when he helped her with heavy lifting around the ranch without being asked, she had started to feel things she had not felt since she was a girl with girlish dreams of romance. But she did not know if he felt the same way. He was always respectful, always proper. He called her Miss Garrett even though she had told him twice that Stella was fine. He never touched her unless it was to adjust her stance during a lesson, and even then he asked permission first. She could not tell if he was simply being a gentleman or if his interest in her was purely as a teacher and nothing more. The uncertainty made her cautious. She had built a good life for herself, independent and secure. The last thing she wanted was to make a fool of herself over a man who might ride out of town as easily as he had ridden in. So she kept her feelings to herself and focused on the lessons, on the competition in Sacramento that was now only a week away. One afternoon, after a particularly good session where Quentin had finally mastered the quick draw technique she had been teaching him, he asked if he could talk to her about something. They were sitting on the porch of her small ranch house, drinking lemonade she had made from the lemons that grew near her kitchen garden. "Of course," she said, trying not to show how nervous his serious tone made her. Quentin set down his glass and turned to face her directly. "I wanted to ask if you would let me come with you to Sacramento. For the competition, I mean. I know you do not need someone to look after you, but the road can be dangerous, and I would feel better knowing you had someone watching your back. And I would like to see you compete. See everything you have taught me put into action at that level. Stella felt a rush of warmth at the thought of him wanting to be there, wanting to see her succeed. You do not have to do that. I have made the trip before by myself. I know I do not have to, Quentin said. I want to. If you will have me. I would like that, Stella said, and she could not keep the smile from her face. I would like that very much. His answering smile was bright enough to rival the afternoon sun. Good, that is good. When do we leave? 3 days. I want to get there a day early, get settled before the competition starts. We can take the stage if you want, but I prefer to ride. It takes longer, but I like having Rosie with me. I will ride with you, Quentin said. My horse could use the exercise anyway. They spent the next 3 days preparing for the trip and continuing the lessons. Stella could feel the change between them, subtle but definite. There was an ease now, a comfort that went beyond student and teacher. When they worked together, their movements were synchronized, each anticipating what the other needed. When they talked, the conversations went deeper, touching on dreams and fears, and the kind of hopes you only shared with someone you trusted. The morning they left for Sacramento, the sky was clear and the air was cool with the last of spring's mildness. Summer heat would arrive soon enough, turning the valley into a furnace, but for now the weather was perfect for traveling. They rode side by side along the road that followed the river north, their horses fresh, and their spirits high. Stella had packed food and camping supplies, planning to camp one night along the way rather than push the horses too hard. As the sun began to set on their first day of travel, they found a good spot near a creek with grass for the horses and a stand of oaks for shelter. Quentin set about building a fire while Stella tended to the animals, and soon they had a cheerful blaze going and coffee brewing in a battered pot. I have been thinking, Quentin said as they ate the cold chicken and biscuits Stella had brought from home, about what I want to do if I stay in Stockton. There is a property that came up for sale last week, about 50 acres bordering the north edge of your ranch. Good grazing land, a decent water source. The owner is an older fellow who wants to move to San Francisco to be near his daughter. He is asking a fair price. Stella knew the property he meant. It was good land, and having Quentin as a neighbor would be wonderful in ways she barely wanted to examine too closely. Are you going to make an offer? I am thinking about it, Quentin said, but I wanted to talk to you first. Make sure you would be all right with me as a neighbor. I know you value your privacy, and I do not want to intrude on that. You would not be intruding, Stella said, and meant it. I think you would make an excellent neighbor, and honestly, it would be nice to have someone nearby that I trust. Someone I could call on if I needed help and who could call on me the same way. Quentin smiled, and in the firelight his eyes looked almost silver. I was hoping you would say that. I will talk to the owner when we get back from Sacramento, see if we can work out a deal. They talked late into the night, making plans and sharing ideas about ranching and livestock, and all the practical details of building a life in the valley. But underneath the practical talk, Stella could feel something else building, a tension that was not quite comfortable but not unpleasant either. She found herself very aware of how close Quentin was sitting, of the way the firelight played across his features, of how his eyes kept returning to her face when he thought she was not looking. When they finally banked the fire and settled into their bedrolls on opposite sides of the dying embers, Stella lay awake for a long time, staring up at the stars and wondering if she had the courage to act on what she was feeling. She had spent so long being independent, so long proving that she did not need anyone. that the thought of reaching out and risking rejection felt nearly impossible. But then she thought of Quentin's smile, of the way he listened when she talked, of how he had asked to come with her not because he thought she needed protection, but because he wanted to be part of her success. And she thought maybe, just maybe, the risk might be worth it. They reached Sacramento late the next afternoon and found rooms at a modest hotel near the competition grounds. Stella spent the evening checking her rifle and her ammunition, making sure everything was in perfect order. Quentin sat with her, cleaning his own gun even though he would not be competing, just keeping her company in the quiet way that had become familiar and precious to her. The competition started early the next morning. Shooters had come from all over Northern California, men with impressive reputations and equipment that gleamed with expensive care. Stella was one of only 3 women competing, and the only one in the rifle category. The other 2 were in pistol competitions, and from the way they were dressed in fancy divided skirts and embroidered blouses, Stella guessed they were exhibition shooters who performed in shows rather than working ranch women. She felt out of place in her simple clothes and worn boots, but when she looked over at the stands where spectators were gathering, she saw Quentin watching her with an expression of complete confidence. He caught her eye and nodded, just once, and she felt her nervousness settle into determination. The competition was structured in rounds, with shooters eliminated after each stage until only the top 5 remained for the final round. The first round was basic accuracy at a fixed distance, and Stella sailed through it easily, hitting all her targets dead center. The second round added moving targets, clay pigeons launched at irregular intervals, and this was where several shooters faltered. But Stella had hunted birds with her father since she was a child, and she knew how to lead a moving target. She cleared the round with a perfect score. By the third round, the crowd had started to pay attention to her. People were whispering, pointing, clearly surprised to see a woman performing so well against the male shooters. Stella tried to ignore the attention and focus on the targets, but it was harder now. The third round required speed as well as accuracy, hitting multiple targets in rapid succession, and she could feel the pressure building. She missed her first target by a fraction of an inch, and her heart sank. But then she heard Quentin's voice cutting through the crowd noise. "You have got this, Stella." And she remembered everything they had worked on together. She relaxed her shoulders, controlled her breathing, and let her training take over. The next 9 targets exploded in perfect sequence, and when she lowered her rifle, the crowd erupted in applause. She made it to the final round along with 4 men, all of whom looked distinctly unhappy about her presence. The final challenge was the most difficult, combining long-distance accuracy with quick target transitions and a limited number of bullets. Each shooter would have 3 minutes to hit as many of the 12 targets as possible, with points awarded based on accuracy and completion time. Stella went last, which meant she had to watch the other 4 shooters first. They were all excellent, hitting between 8 and 10 targets each, with the best shooter, a grizzled man from Redding named Patterson, hitting 11 out of 12. The crowd clearly expected him to win, and his confident swagger as he stepped back from the line suggested he expected it too. Then it was Stella's turn. She stepped up to the mark, loaded her Winchester with steady hands, and waited for the signal to start. The judge called out, the timer started, and Stella began to shoot. The world narrowed to targets and breathing and the familiar weight of her rifle. She moved through the sequence the way she had moved through 1,000 practice sessions, smooth and efficient and completely focused. The targets were far, some of them nearly 200 yards out, but she had been making shots like that since she was 15. When she fired her 12th and final shot, She knew even before the judge confirmed it that she had hit every single target. The crowd knew it too, because the applause that erupted was deafening. She had not only hit all 12, but she had done it in under 2.5 minutes, faster than any of the other finalists. The judge declared her the winner, and Stella found herself accepting a trophy and a cash prize, while newspaper reporters shouted questions at her, and spectators pressed close to get a better look. It was overwhelming and exciting and slightly terrifying all at once. But then Quentin was there, pushing through the crowd with a smile that made her forget everything else. "You were incredible," he said, and the pride in his voice made her chest feel tight. "Absolutely incredible. I knew you were good, but seeing you up there, seeing what you can really do, it was something else." "I could not have done it without you," Stella said, and she meant it. "The practice we did together, the techniques you made me think about more carefully, all of that helped. You helped." Quentin shook his head. "That was all you, Stella. I just watched and learned. You are the one with the gift." They were standing very close together, close enough that Stella could see the exact shade of gray in his eyes, could count the faint freckles across his nose that the sun had brought out. The noise of the crowd seemed to fade away, leaving just the two of them in a bubble of shared triumph and something deeper, something that had been building for weeks and was now impossible to ignore. "Quentin," she said, and her voice came out softer than she intended. "I need to tell you something." But before she could continue, a reporter pushed between them, asking her questions about her training and whether she planned to compete professionally. The moment broke, and Stella found herself swept up in interviews and photographs and all the chaos of sudden fame. By the time she finally escaped back to the hotel, she was exhausted, and the courage she had felt earlier had faded into uncertainty. Quentin walked her to her room, and they stood awkwardly in the hallway, neither quite sure how to end the evening. Finally, Stella said, "Thank you for coming with me, for supporting me. It meant more than you probably know." "I would not have missed it for anything," Quentin said. He hesitated, then added, "Stella, there is something I have been wanting to say to you for a while now, but I have not known how, or if I should. But after today, after seeing you up there, so strong and confident and absolutely brilliant, I think I have to say it or I will regret it forever." Stella's heart was suddenly beating so hard she was sure he must be able to hear it. "What is it?" "I am falling in love with you," Quentin said, the words coming out in a rush. "I know that probably is not what you want to hear. I know I am supposed to be your student and nothing more. But I cannot keep pretending that is all you are to me. You are the most remarkable woman I have ever met, and these past few weeks with you have been the happiest of my life. I am sorry if that makes things awkward, but I had to tell you. You deserve to know." For a moment, Stella could not speak. Relief and joy and a fear that this might somehow not be real all tangled together in her chest. Then she stepped forward, closing the distance between them, and took his hand. "You are not making things awkward," she said. "You are making things perfect, because I am falling in love with you too." The smile that broke across Quentin's face was like dawn after a long night. "You are?" "Yes," she said, laughing at the disbelief in his voice. "I have been for weeks now. I just did not know if you felt the same way, and I was afraid to risk our friendship by saying anything." "We are both fools then," Quentin said. And then he was pulling her close, and she was reaching up to meet him, and they were kissing in the hotel hallway with all the pent-up feeling of weeks of want and uncertainty finally released. When they finally pulled apart, both slightly breathless, Quentin rested his forehead against hers. "I am going to buy that property," he said. "I am going to build a house and start a ranch and put down roots in Stockton. And I am going to court you properly, Stella Garrett. I am going to take you to dances and church socials and anywhere else you want to go. I am going to prove to you every single day that you made the right choice in taking a chance on me." I already know I did, Stella said, but I will not say no to proper courting. As long as we can still have shooting lessons, I am not done teaching you yet. I will be your student for as long as you will have me, Quentin promised, in shooting and everything else. They stood together in the hallway for a long time, talking and laughing and making plans, until another hotel guest cleared their throat pointedly, and they realized they were blocking the passage. Stella went to bed that night feeling like her whole life had shifted, like the future that had looked so solitary and predictable now held possibilities she had hardly dared to dream about. The ride back to Stockton felt different from the journey out. They rode closer together, their hands occasionally brushing as they walked the horses side by side. They talked about the future openly now, about the ranch Quentin would build and how their properties could support each other. They talked about what it would mean to combine their lives, how they could maintain their independence while still building something together. When they reached Stockton, Quentin went straight to the property owner and made an offer that was accepted on the spot. Within a week, he owned 50 acres of good California land and was making plans to build a house and start a small herd. Stella helped him draw up the plans, and they spent long evenings on her porch discussing cattle breeds and irrigation and all the practical details of ranching. But there were other evenings too, evenings when they sat close together and talked about things that had nothing to do with work. Quentin told her about his childhood, about the parents he still missed, and the siblings who had scattered after their deaths. Stella told him about her own losses, about the loneliness of the past 2 years, and how his presence had changed everything. True to his word, Quentin courted her properly. He took her to a town dance where they scandalized the older ladies by being far more interested in talking to each other than socializing with the crowd. He invited her to dinner at the hotel restaurant, where they had to suffer through curious glances from other diners. He brought her wildflowers from the fields and books from the traveling merchant who came through town once a month. But Stella's favorite times were still the mornings when Quentin came to her ranch for shooting practice. They had long since passed the point where he needed lessons, but they kept up the tradition anyway, using it as an excuse to spend time together and work on increasingly difficult techniques. Sometimes they competed against each other, setting up challenging courses and seeing who could complete them faster or more accurately. Sometimes they just shot for the pleasure of it, the meditation of target practice in the cool morning air. 3 months after the Sacramento competition, on a morning when the summer heat was just starting to build but the air was still bearable, Quentin showed up at Stella's ranch with a serious expression that made her worry something was wrong. "Is everything all right?" she asked as he dismounted. "Everything is perfect," he said. "But I need to ask you something, and I do not want to wait any longer." He pulled a small box from his pocket and dropped to one knee right there in the dust of her yard, with the chickens scratching around his boots and the morning sun painting everything gold. "Stella Garrett, you are the strongest, smartest, most incredible woman I have ever known. You have taught me more than just how to shoot. You have taught me what it means to find a place to belong, what it feels like to want to build a future with someone instead of just drifting from place to place. I love you more than I thought it was possible to love anyone. Will you marry me?" Stella felt tears prick her eyes, the good kind that came from happiness too big to contain. "Yes," she said, pulling him to his feet so she could kiss him properly. "Yes, absolutely yes." The ring was simple, a thin gold band with a small diamond that caught the light. It fit perfectly, and Stella could not stop looking at it as they stood together in her yard, wrapped up in each other and grinning like fools. They were married 2 months later in the Stockton church, with what felt like the entire town in attendance. The ladies of the church had decorated the pews with late summer wildflowers, and Stella wore a dress of cream-colored silk that had been her mother's, altered to fit her taller frame. Quentin wore a new suit that he complained made him feel stiff and formal, but Stella thought he looked impossibly handsome in it. Mayor Henderson performed the ceremony, and when he pronounced them husband and wife, the church erupted in applause. They walked out into the September sunshine as Mr. and Mrs. Ellis, and Stella felt like her heart might burst from the sheer rightness of it all. The town threw them a reception in the town square, with tables laden with food and a band playing dancing music. Stella danced with Quentin until her feet hurt, and then danced some more because she could not bear to stop, could not bear to let go of this perfect day. When people came up to congratulate them, they did it together, his arm around her waist and her hand in his, a unit already. They spent their wedding night in Quentin's newly finished house on his property, in the bedroom they had planned together with windows facing east to catch the morning light. It was strange and wonderful and deeply right, finally being together without reservation or restraint. Stella had been nervous, but Quentin was gentle and patient, and the love between them made everything natural and beautiful. In the morning, they woke to sunlight streaming through those east-facing windows and the sound of birds in the oak trees outside. Stella turned to find Quentin watching her with an expression of such tenderness that it made her breath catch. "Good morning, Mrs. Ellis," he said. "Good morning, Mr. Ellis," she replied, trying out the new name and liking the way it sounded. They spent the next few days settling into their new life together, figuring out the rhythms of sharing space and making decisions as a partnership. Quentin moved some of his cattle onto his land, and Stella helped him build the fences and shelters they needed. In turn, he helped her with the heavy work on her ranch, the tasks that had been difficult to manage alone, but they maintained some independence too. Stella kept her ranch in her name, and Quentin respected that completely. They were partners, not owner and possession. They made decisions together, but they also trusted each other to manage their own responsibilities. It was the kind of marriage Stella had always hoped for, equal and respectful, and built on genuine affection rather than just social convenience. As autumn turned toward winter, they settled into comfortable routines. They still practiced shooting together most mornings, though now it was at one ranch or the other, depending on what else needed to be done that day. They took their meals together, and Stella discovered that Quentin was a surprisingly good cook, especially when it came to the simple trail meals he had learned during his years on cattle drives. She taught him how to bake bread the way her mother had taught her, and they spent a memorable afternoon covered in flour, laughing at their own ineptitude. They went to church together on Sundays and to town socials when the mood struck them. But they were just as happy spending quiet evenings on the porch, talking about their days and making plans for the future. Quentin wanted to expand his herd next spring, and Stella was thinking about breeding Rosie to a good stallion and starting a line of horses. They talked about eventually combining their properties, maybe building a bigger house somewhere between the two existing ones, but they agreed there was no rush. They had time to figure it out. In December, Stella realized she was pregnant. She had suspected for a few weeks, but she wanted to be sure before she told Quentin. When Doc Patterson confirmed it, she rode straight home to find Quentin working on fixing a section of fence. "I have news," she said, dismounting and walking over to him. He looked up, immediately attentive. "What kind of news?" "The good kind," she said, taking his hands. "The very good kind. We are going to have a baby." For a moment, Quentin just stared at her, processing. Then his face broke into the widest smile she had ever seen, and he was picking her up and spinning her around, both of them laughing. "A baby," he said when he finally set her down. We are going to have a baby. Stella, that is incredible. You are incredible. It will change things, she warned. I will not be able to work as hard as I usually do, especially later on, and once the baby comes, everything will be different. I know, Quentin said, pulling her close, and I cannot wait. We will figure it out together, just like we figure out everything else. The pregnancy was not easy. Stella struggled with sickness in the early months, and the summer heat made her uncomfortable in ways she had never experienced before. But Quentin was endlessly patient and helpful, taking on more of her work without complaint and making sure she rested when she needed to. He worried about her constantly, which was both touching and occasionally annoying, but she knew it came from love. In early August of 1883, after a long and difficult labor that had Quentin pacing the floor in terror while Doc Patterson and the midwife attended to Stella, their son was born. He was perfect, with dark hair like his mother and gray eyes like his father, and lungs that worked perfectly if his immediate and vigorous crying was any indication. "He is beautiful," Quentin said, holding his son with the careful reverence of someone handling the most precious thing in the world. "He is absolutely beautiful, just like his mother." They named him James, after Stella's father, and settled into the exhausting but joyful work of caring for an infant. Stella had worried that she would chafe at being tied to the house, at not being able to ride and shoot and do all the things that had defined her life. But she found that motherhood brought its own satisfactions, its own challenges and rewards. And Quentin was a dedicated father, getting up for nighttime feedings and changing diapers and walking the floor with James when he was fussy. "I never knew I could love someone this much," Quentin said one evening, watching James sleep in his cradle. "I thought what I felt for you was the biggest love I was capable of, but this is something else. It is like my heart got bigger." "I know exactly what you mean," Stella said, leaning against him. "It is terrifying and wonderful all at once." As James grew from infant to toddler, Stella gradually returned to her regular work, though the balance had shifted. She still rode and shot and managed her ranch, but she did it around the needs of her son, and later, around the needs of the daughter who was born 2 years after James. They named her Caroline, and she had Stella's dark eyes and a stubborn streak that promised she would be a handful. The years passed in the way years do when life is full and happy. They expanded their operations, combining the 2 ranches into one larger spread that they managed together. Quentin's initial 50 acres grew to 200, and Stella's inheritance grew with it. They hired hands to help with the work, good men who respected Stella's skill and authority as much as they respected Quentin's. Stella continued to compete in shooting competitions, though less frequently now that she had children to care for. But when she did compete, Quentin always came with her, and later, the children came too, watching their mother with the same awe and pride that Quentin still felt every time he saw her shoot. James and Caroline both learned to shoot almost as soon as they could hold a rifle, with Stella teaching them the same careful techniques her father had taught her. James was good, steady, and accurate, but Caroline was something special. By the time she was 12, she could outshoot most of the men in town, and Stella saw her own younger self in her daughter's determined focus. "She is just like you," Quentin said one evening, watching Caroline practice in the fading light. "Same fire, same skill. She is going to be incredible." "She already is," Stella said, feeling a mother's pride mixed with the satisfaction of passing on her father's legacy. "And she is going to have more opportunities than I did. The world is changing. Women are starting to be taken more seriously as marksmen and competitors. She will be able to go farther than I ever could." Life was not without its challenges. There were hard winters when they lost cattle to cold and disease. There were dry summers when water was scarce and tensions ran high among the valley ranchers. There were injuries and illnesses, financial setbacks and disagreements that had to be worked through. But through it all, Stella and Quentin faced everything together. They argued sometimes, because they were both strong-willed and opinionated, but they always talked things through and found compromise. They supported each other through grief when friends died and celebrated together when good things happened. They built a life that was rich and full and deeply rooted in the land they loved. On their 20th anniversary, Quentin surprised Stella by taking her back to the spot where they had camped on their way to Sacramento, the place where she had first really understood that she was falling in love with him. They left the children with trusted friends and rode out together, just the two of them and the memories. They made camp by the creek and built a fire as the sun set, and Stella felt like she was 22 again, on the edge of something new and wonderful. But it was better now, because she knew how the story turned out. She knew that the risk she had taken had been worth it, that the life they had built together was everything she could have hoped for. "You remember what we talked about that night?" Quentin asked as they sat by the fire. "About wanting to find a place to belong, about putting down roots." "I remember," Stella said. "I just want you to know that I found it," Quentin said, taking her hand. "Not just in Stockton, not just in the ranch, but in you. You are my home, Stella. You always have been. From that first day when I asked you to teach me what you know, you have been the center of everything that matters to me." Stella felt tears well up, the happy kind that came from being understood completely. "You are my home too," she said. "You took a lonely woman who thought she had to do everything herself, and showed her that partnership could be even better than independence. That love did not have to mean giving up who you are." They sat together by the fire, talking and laughing and remembering, until the stars came out overhead and the night grew cold. Then they went to their tent and held each other, grateful for everything they had built and everything they still had ahead of them. The years continued to pass, bringing changes and challenges, but also deep satisfaction. James grew into a capable young man who took over much of the day-to-day running of the ranch, freeing Quentin and Stella to focus on the bigger picture of expansion and improvement. He married a local girl, sweet-natured Mary Thompson, and they built a house on the far side of the property where they started their own family. Caroline proved to be as talented as Stella had predicted, winning her first major shooting competition at 16 and going on to compete professionally. She traveled to competitions all over the West, but she always came home to Stockton, to the ranch and the family that had shaped her. She eventually married too, a fellow shooter named Daniel Wright, who respected her skill and independence, and together they built a reputation as the best shooting duo in California. By the time Stella and Quentin reached their 40s, they were grandparents several times over, and the ranch that had started as two separate small properties had grown into one of the most successful operations in the San Joaquin Valley. They employed a dozen hands year-round and twice that during busy seasons. Their cattle were known for their quality, and their horses were sought after throughout the region. But more than the success, more than the reputation, what mattered to Stella was the family they had built. On Sundays, when everyone gathered at the main house for dinner, when the table was crowded with children and grandchildren, and the air was full of laughter and conversation, she would catch Quentin's eye across the chaos and see in his expression the same contentment she felt. They had built something lasting, not just a business or a legacy, but a life full of love and purpose. The young woman who had once thought she had to do everything alone had learned that partnership made everything richer. The drifting cowboy who had never felt like he belonged anywhere had found his home. One evening in their 60th year, as they sat on the porch of the house they had eventually built together. The house that sat between their original properties and represented the joining of their lives. Quentin said, "Do you ever regret it? Taking a chance on a stranger who asked you to teach him to shoot?" Stella laughed and took his hand, feeling the familiar calluses and the strength that was still there despite the years. "Not for a single moment. You were the best student I ever had, and the best partner, and the best love." "The feeling is entirely mutual," Quentin said, raising her hand to his lips. "You could shoot straighter than any man in town, and I said, 'Teach me what you know.' But you taught me so much more than shooting. You taught me what it means to build a real life. To be part of something bigger than yourself. To love someone so completely that their happiness becomes as important as your own." "We taught each other," Stella said. "That is what partnership is. I learned from you too, how to let someone in, how to trust that asking for help is not weakness, how to build something together that is better than what either of us could have created alone." They sat together as the sun set over the valley, over the land they had worked and the life they had built. In the distance, they could see James checking the fence line and hear Caroline's children playing in the yard near her house. The air smelled of summer grass and cattle, and the wild roses that Stella had planted years ago and that now grew all around the property. It had been a good life, Stella thought. A life full of purpose and love and the kind of deep satisfaction that came from knowing you had done things right. She had proven herself when the world said women could not be as skilled as men. She had built a successful ranch when people said a woman could not manage such things alone. And most importantly, she had found love with a man who saw her strength and celebrated it rather than feeling threatened by it. "I love you," she said to Quentin. The words as true now as they had been 40 years ago when she first said them in a hotel hallway in Sacramento. "I love you too," Quentin replied, and they sat together in the gathering darkness, their hands joined and their hearts full, knowing that whatever time they had left would be spent exactly the way they wanted to spend it. Together, in the place they had built, surrounded by the family they had created and the love that had made it all possible. The story of the woman who could shoot straighter than any man in town, and the cowboy who had asked her to teach him what she knew had become a legend in Stockton, told and retold with admiration, and sometimes embellishment. But the real story, the one that mattered, was simpler and deeper than any legend. It was a story of two people who had found each other at exactly the right moment, who had taken a chance on love and built a life that honored both of their strengths and dreams. It was a story of partnership and respect, of teaching and learning, of independence and togetherness existing side by side. It was a story that had started with a rifle shot in a dusty town square and had grown into something beautiful and lasting, something that would continue through their children and grandchildren, through the land they had tended and the legacy they had created. As the stars came out over the San Joaquin Valley, and the night sounds of the ranch settled around them, Stella and Quentin remained on their porch, content in the knowledge that they had found what everyone searches for: a love that lasts, a purpose that matters, and a home that is built not just of wood and land but of shared dreams and mutual devotion. Their story had been one worth living, and the ending, when it eventually came, would be not an ending at all but the final chapter of something that would continue long after they were gone, in the hearts and lives of everyone they had touched.